And time for a second attempt at recording a video. Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and just as I said, this is my second time trying to record this video because I've been testing out some different audio settings and stuff. Basically every video that I record, I have been adjusting one other thing just kind of now and again to get back to a little bit more of a normal audio setting that I had before I had issues like a month ago or something like that at this point. This video I happened to turn on one that completely scuffed the audio, which meant that it was basically unusable, but I also wasn't too miffed about it because I wasn't very happy with how the first version of this video ended up turning out. And while it's true that most of my videos that I don't like after recording end up being fine after editing, this one was one where I don't feel like I actually ended up making a lot of my points the way that I wanted to, if that makes any sense. So we're just going to try this all again. What is the topic of today's video? Well, the topic of today's video is morally gray characters. First off, I want to give a little shout out to Chance Dillon, who had me on a couple of his live streams about a month ago at this point. A month ago yesterday, he released his first book, Mercy, Tears of the Fallen. Did a couple live streams to celebrate that on his channel. I was part of them, and at one point in one or maybe even both of the streams, I forget off the top of my head, the topic kind of got around to morally gray characters, and it got me thinking a little bit about the topic in ways that I found interesting and that I wanted to talk a little bit more about in a dedicated video. In fact, I'm pretty sure I said on live stream with Chance and some of the others there that I should probably make a video on the topic because I thought that I had enough to say about it. And it turns out I did. I made it into a video, and here it is now. Without further ado, let's kind of jump into the video and start off with defining what I think a morally gray character is supposed to be and how they generally should exist to get the biggest effect from them. Keep in mind, some of this is going to be my personal opinion, some of this is going to be a little bit more conjecture. I haven't read a ton of stuff with what people would consider to be morally gray characters, but of course we're going to get into some of these topics as they pertain to audiences currently, as opposed to what I think they should pertain to a little bit later. We'll get into all of that in due time. So to start, what is a morally gray character supposed to be? Well, in my opinion, this topic already gets pretty complicated just from the beginning with the definition of the term, solely because there's multiple different ways to view a morally gray character. And to be fair, there's also a spectrum of moral grayness, because gray falls in between the scale of black or evil and then white and good. So basically the idea of a morally gray character falls somewhere in between the scales of abjectly good and abjectly evil, or isn't constrained to being one or the other. A morally gray character is somebody who should tend to do both good deeds and bad deeds, often knowingly doing so, depending on what it is they're motivated by. They're characters who are often going to be behaving in some kind of marked self-interest, more or less regardless of the outcome of that, whether the outcome of that is good for everybody else or bad for everybody else. It's going to be more about their own thing. Morally gray characters, I think, are pretty effective if they are rather selfish when compared to other not as selfish characters, or rather not selfish characters who aren't already evil to begin with. And then there's also the realm of morally gray characters who have motivations or goals that are just kind of unclear or hard to pin down, or that are simply unpredictable. They're just characters who, like I said at the start, generally just don't really fit into either good person or bad person categories, and fall somewhere in between, where maybe certain sections of a book or a movie or whatever type of media they fall in, they are good, and other moments they are bad. There are intricacies to any kind of a topic of this sort, but this, I feel like, seems to cover the majority of what that idea should generally reflect. And if you're going to use morally gray characters, well, what are the benefits of doing that? Well, I think some of the more obvious benefits to using morally gray characters are things like being able to explore somewhat dingier subject matter and also being able to explore more realistic reactions to some of that subject matter. Darker themes can be a little bit more prevalent if many characters are not strictly good people, and also not really bad people either. You can have themes and discussions and exploration of different ideas within a story with a lot of morally gray characters by simply having them exist on a spectrum that is not cartoonishly evil and also not straight up, biblical analogy good or something like that. You can also come up with characters that have a very diverse set of motivations and goals and beliefs, and also experiences that inform those motivations and goals. The way that each character sees the world is going to be a little bit more personal when they're allowed to have a rather gray morality scale to exist upon, because the way their experiences color that perspective is a pretty major part of where that perspective comes from, rather than existing within a world that has a set good and bad morality scale and where people are kind of, motivated to feel pretty strongly one direction or the other. You can have characters who fall somewhere in between, a little bit more like real life. Kind of what I said about realistic reactions to different subject matter. This is kind of what I'm getting at there. You can also include some more inherent ambiguity where other characters who are more on a black and white morality scale might not be able to have some ambiguity. Say in the midst of a black and white morality cast, if you have a random character or two in the midst of them that are really gray in their morality or who are hard to pin down in their motivations, you can have an air of ambiguity, but like mystery and just intrigue that boil around those characters that make them inherently more interesting to follow or to think about than maybe some of the black and white characters. Beyond that, not seeing a morally gray character's POV in this kind of a case, if they're surrounded by non-morally gray characters, can make for that intrigue to be accentuated, to make a little bit more of a difference in the story, and that can allow an author to even misdirect readers at various different turns, where you have a mysterious or unsettling even kind of character who falls on a gray morality spectrum compared to, say, a bunch of just basically inherently good people as characters. They're going to look at that and be like, I don't trust that guy, but then it turns out maybe they can actually trust them for one reason or another, but maybe they can't trust them about certain other things. You can have better character dynamics when you have some of them that are, again, a little bit harder to pin down. And kind of like what I already said earlier as well, you can just dig into characters that are more human. You can have more realistic people in the roles of characters, because they're not just straight up every single thing that I think or believe is the stereotypical modern Western ideal, therefore I'm good, or I am against everything of the modern Western stereotypical ideal and therefore evil. You can have a spectrum where some of the things that a character believes can be abjectly good, and some of the things could be just straight up horrifyingly awful, but that comes from just realistic human intentions. And fun fact, that is actually realistic. If everybody believed the exact same things and all of those exact same things were, all good or all evil, that would actually kind of be a problem. What would be the point of anything, really, if that were the case? But I also hinted at earlier, a big part of how you can make characters a little bit more real and human is by being able to explore more chaotic or traumatic pasts and experiences that characters can have that actually inform their opinions, rather than holding an opinion because they should, because it's good, or holding a bad opinion because it's evil and they're the bad guy. They can have experiences that actually inform where they fall on the spectrum, and that is a little bit more real, that's more realistic, that's more human. You can also add aspects to a character that make them a little bit more unpredictable. You can allow them to change their opinions throughout based off of experience that occur throughout the story, and that can kind of change where a character falls. And finally, you can also just kind of make characters aim towards a goal. They can have a goal, even if that goal isn't ambiguous, like I described some morally gray characters as having earlier. Even if they have a set goal, you can allow for characters to ultimately fail at that over the course of their trying, even if they have worthy goals, or the opposite. If you have a character who's trying to be good but has such deep set flaws that hold them back, that can make for really interesting characters. If you have somebody who's really trying to do the right thing, but his personal goal is actually something that counters the right thing, you can have some moral quandaries within the mind of a character that becomes an interesting thing to explore. Finally, you can also have characters who are like actually funneling actively towards evil without even realizing that's what they're doing. You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions is a stereotypical phrase for a reason. Maybe you can have morally gray characters who have a good intention but don't realize that everything they're doing on that path is actually frankly god-awful and really not a good thing, but they don't realize that because their goal is noble. Do the ends justify the means can be a very common question in media that explores gray morality, and I think that is a good thing. And if nothing else, morally gray characters can provide a different outlook for other characters. This can be in the context of a group of good characters, or even of the villain of a story, depending on how it is executed. The fact that they are kind of separate from that black and white morality of other characters or the world is something that makes this entire thing possible. So with all of this being said, all these good things that I've lined out, what is the problem that I have with morally gray characters and with people calling things morally gray? Well, I think that the problem that I have with this is that morally gray doesn't actually mean, in a modern media landscape, what people think it means. Because what people think it means is something a little bit different, it's a little bit darker. The definition that I gave you for what morally gray characters should be is not often what characters described as morally gray actually tend to be. Now, recall something that I just said a moment ago. Being separate from a black and white morality scale is a lot of what allows for moral gray characters or a world or something like that to actually have an effect on the reader, or to make contextual sense, or to, actually be impactful within the context of a story. If every single character is morally gray, then none of them are really actually that gray. They're all just kind of a shade of black at that point. If there's no white to offset it, or if there's no black to offset it, gray doesn't really have a meaning anymore. And I think that that is the problem that we are starting to see now, where gray morality doesn't actually have a set meaning anymore that actually matters. It's just kind of a term that people use. I think that most good characters, and by good in this context I mean well written, technically good characters, not just good people who are characters. I mean good characters who are interesting to read about. All of them have a degree of grayness to them. You can write characters who are just straight up evil or just straight up good. Those take a little bit more skill to get right, ironically enough. But all good characters have something to them that makes them gray. Now, they might be very close to white, or they might be very close to black, but there's going to be some gray in there. As a result, you're going to have a very large spectrum of characters that fall anywhere on it, and that can kind of lead this problem to get a little bit messy as time goes on, and in my opinion, as we have seen. In the modern media landscape, I have kind of noticed that morally gray doesn't actually tend to mean morally gray anymore, as in it doesn't mean a character that falls in the middle of a spectrum between good and evil. Morally gray often just tends to describe a character who is willing to be a really bad person, who is willing to do really bad things, whatever the reason may be. Now, while this is part of how morally gray characters have come to be, I defined that in the definition earlier. It's less become a character who is knowingly committing both good and bad deeds for whatever purposes they are going for. Moral grayness nowadays seems as if it's more describing characters who are just willing to be a piece of shit. Again, regardless of whether that's actually their goal. Most morally gray characters are no longer just characters who do bad things sometimes. They are just straight up bad people who occasionally do good things. And I think that that is a little bit different. Almost always they are knowingly just doing bad things, almost never really doing anything good, or not nearly as motivated to do good things because of the circumstances they're in or because of the world they're in. And we'll get to this a little bit later as well. In my opinion, kind of like I hinted at earlier, I don't think that that's actually gray morality. That's basically just various shades of evil. If all of your characters are just straight up willing to be bad, and like that is the thing that defines them, they're willing to do really garbage things to other people, that's not necessarily morally gray. That's just kind of bad, even if there's hints of good in there. It's just kind of a weird dichotomy that I feel like I'm still not doing a great job of explaining, but in my mind, I feel like those are two different things. Somebody who's willing to do both good and bad things is different than somebody who's just completely willing to be a piece of shit because they're selfish or whatever motivations just kind of tend to be on the bad side. By this point in time, you have a bunch of heroes who are actually anti-heroes, and that's kind of where that moral grayness comes from. And then you just have other villains who are also just kind of morally gray. So you have a bunch of gray characters who are like on the darker side of the spectrum, and they don't tend to exist on the lighter side of the spectrum. And that's where I think the problem tends to come from. Maybe some of those villains are a little bit more sympathetic than other villains, and maybe those heroes are a little bit less sympathetic than other heroes, and that's kind of what makes them morally gray. But the irony is that now your ability to diversify these characters from an objective moral good and an objective moral bad kind of makes this a very muddy and blurry spectrum that no longer is really a spectrum, because again, there's no objective white or black to compare that to. A lot of what makes gray morality work is if you have that contrast, the white and the black, to actually compare them to within the spectrum. If you don't have that good, if you don't have that evil, if you don't have both of them, gray morality doesn't actually mean anything. It's kind of just is a thing, what it is. And then you have the fact that a lot of authors will look at a morally gray character and be like, oh yeah, that character's a little bit more interesting than just a straight up good person. So what they end up doing is they make all of their characters some manner of morally gray, and eventually this ends up just kind of creating a lack of a value system at all. So the world morality just kind of disappears. And what happens when you have a lack of a value system? What happens when you lack an inherent good or an inherent bad? But what happens when you lack both of those things or either one of them? You kind of just end up with a world that feels very nihilistic. And what is nihilism aside from not being morally gray? Because nihilism focuses as an idea on the lack of good, the lack of meaning, the lack of purpose, and too much gray morality leads to nihilism, and nihilism inevitably leads to just blackness, and that just becomes the inherent world morality. And this is where we come into the section that will probably get me in a little bit more hot water. That is the Grimdark emergence and effect, and the way that readers and, to a degree, authors kind of talk about morally gray characters and a morally gray world, because Grimdark is kind of synonymous with morally gray in the epic fantasy sphere nowadays, and that's primarily where I'm coming at this topic from. It could be relevant to other portions of the discussion, but this is basically where I'm coming from here. Remember what I said earlier about morally gray characters having the best effect when they are separate from a world morality. They exist within their own moral framework, but the world morality is still, one that has a relative white and black in it, and that's kind of what makes those characters stand out. Yeah, once you get into Grimdark and these kinds of effects that a Grimdark world has, things get really messy, things just kind of all become dark gray, and then nothing else really tends to exist. You have that kind of endless spiral of too many morally gray characters creating a nihilistic tone and world, which just then becomes morally black as time goes on, and that often combines with a very heavily dark, or at the very least, morally gray world that Grimdark usually tends to be advertised as containing, and these very heavily kind of combine and exacerbate all of the problems that I outlined a little bit above. So you have some ideals of what morally gray should be that no longer really work out. If morally gray means being willing to do bad things, but also being willing to do good things, no, now you just are a shitty person whenever because everybody else is also that way. If morally gray is supposed to mean not fitting into a hard good or evil scale, now it just means that you are nihilistic for nihilism's sake because that is the state of the entire world, because screw everything, am I right? And that kind of reduces the effect of the characters. If morally gray is supposed to mean existing between a categorical good and a categorical evil for your own means, because you have your own motivations and goals that are kind of separate from that world morality, well, now it just means doing whatever suits you whenever for no reason at all. You have no motivations that are separate from the world morality because the entire world morality is everything sucks. You just kind of have to figure it out. And like, that kind of doesn't work. Morally gray doesn't actually mean anything if there is no meaning in the world that separates it, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know if that's making sense, but I hope you kind of see what I'm getting at. At this point, that death spiral, that endless spiral that I mentioned earlier, has kind of reached its peak, or in this case, rather trough. It's kind of reached the bottom where, again, morally gray doesn't actually mean anything anymore. Instead of an actually morally gray character or world, you just have bad people who are doing bad things on purpose, often without reservation or without second thought, because the world either forces or necessitates such evil behavior because that's what literally everybody else does, or because the world is so corrupt that, again, the characters just don't know any better. And I say again, just as I did in the last section, that isn't really morally gray, that's just evil. That's just various shades of black. That's various hues of black. There's no longer shades of gray in here. It's just all kind of darkness. And like, that doesn't actually work. Instead of having those shades of gray in between a black and a white, you wind up with those hues of black that basically become unintelligible after a certain point in time. That's not to say that you can't make good stories or have good and interesting characters within these kinds of stories if this is the case. That's absolutely not true. In fact, I actually really commend authors who manage to make you root for actively really bad people as characters just because they're able to write them so well. And you should definitely commend authors for being able to do that as well. My beef with this and this situation just comes from calling things morally gray when there's no white or black to make that grayness actually stand out. It doesn't mean anything if there's no separate world morality for it to mean anything. So basically, I just want people to stop calling things morally gray that aren't morally gray. I want them to stop calling things morally gray when they're actually just straight up white or black, in this case almost unanimously black. And I also want people to stop calling grimdark things as a whole as kind of a quote-unquote genre-wide phenomenon. These things need to stop being called morally gray when they aren't actually morally gray, because at this point it's really just, oh yeah, grimdark world, morally gray characters, that's the entire appeal of it. And it's like, not really, because most of that is, again, just kind of shades of black. You have an entire tone and mood of the world that is pretty separate from an objective good, where, like, maybe you have a character or something that is actually seeking for a good, and at that point, that's a good character, not a morally gray one. So, yeah, like, yeah, just stop calling these things, stop conflating moral grayness with grimdark, because these don't really work out, and then just stop calling things morally gray that aren't actually morally gray, and then stop using so much moral gray material that it no longer means anything. I guess that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get at here. And I think the irony of this entire situation is kind of something that I mentioned earlier, that readers are primarily kind of doing this to themselves. It is usually readers calling things morally gray incorrectly, and it is now only that readers have made that kind of thing so prevalent, that have made morally gray to mean something that it is not, that now everybody else is using it as well. Even authors are using it to describe worlds and characters that are actually not morally gray in really any discernible way, just because, again, that term has been utilized so incorrectly for so long, and it has been normalized in such a way, and that's been kind of bothering me as of recent. And then kind of on the Grimdark side of things, like I've been saying, if you want to read something with ambiguous morality or morally gray characters and the like, too often other readers are just going to kind of dump you into that Grimdark sphere because of the way that these two terms have kind of been conflated with one another, which, you know, maybe that's not always a bad thing. There is absolutely going to be good grimdark material in all of these respects, but just like how readers tend to call things underrated when underrated does not actually apply to that thing, you know, using the term underrated incorrectly, they also have a bad habit of mislabeling other things just because it's become normal to do so, and because the actual meaning of that term has kind of been lost, and often this comes without even realizing it. I'm sure that there are probably some people who read, like, say, a bunch of Grimdark that just use morally gray to describe all of it without realizing that that's not actually what that means. So at the end of the day, I don't really blame anybody in particular. I just kind of hope that it gets better. I know it won't, but, you know, I did make a video entitled more or less something like "Stop Calling Things Underrated," just like I'm calling this video "Stop Calling Things Morally Gray," and even though neither of them are going to have any effect on anybody, I still feel like I wanted to get my opinion out there. So I guess that's going to be the end of my soapbox for today. I hope you got something out of this discussion. I'm sure that there are going to be people who disagree with my takes on this matter, and that is totally okay. And if you do disagree, if you can articulate why, I am actually curious to hear some counterpoints to that, so comment anything you have to say down in the comments below. And I want to thank Chance once again for having me on some of his live streams last month where the idea for this video came about. I really appreciate that. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this video turned out being okay. I'm feeling at the time of recording like it did, which is a pretty rare thing for discussion videos like this, so I'll just say I'm satisfied, and I hope you are too. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in whatever I upload next.